I was excited for Avowed. Obsidian have always been an incredibly talented developer, the game always looked cool, but during my actual playthrough of the game, something just didn't feel right. I was having a lot of fun with the game, I was enjoying myself, but the game felt empty. Avowed serves as a perfectly competent video game. It works as intended, it's fun to play, but it doesn't have a soul. And if there's one thing you absolutely cannot do when making an RPG, it's make it soulless. Before we begin, if you do end up enjoying the video, then please make sure to subscribe, as we are trying to hit 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year. But enough of that nonsense, let's begin with the combat. At its core, Avowed takes a first-person action RPG approach. You can switch to third person, but I never did. You can wield melee weapons, cast spells, and even dual wield different combinations like a sword and a spell, or two different magical abilities at once. This flexibility is one of the best things about the combat. It allows you to choose your build and how you want to approach fights. But here is the problem. Avowed's combat starts off strong, it's fun, but the more that you play, the more you realise how shallow it really is. While you have access to all these different weapons and spells, the game doesn't give you much incentive to really experiment beyond your initial build. Once you find a playstyle that works for you, you'll probably stick with that for most of the game. There aren't enough challenging enemy types that force you to switch things up, and because the combat system lacks deeper mechanics, it does start to feel really repetitive over time. For example, if you go all in on melee, most fights will play out the same way. You'll swing, you'll block, you maybe dodge, and you'll repeat that. If your focus is on magic, it's mostly about spamming your favourite spells while keeping a bit of distance. There's not much tactical thinking involved in Avowed, and that's where I feel is a big missed opportunity. One of the most exciting aspects of Avowed's combat, though, at least at first, is the magic system, and this is where I spent most of my time. Unlike traditional RPGs where spellcasting is kind of slow and methodical, Avowed makes magic feel really fast and fluid. Wands act almost like fantasy-themed firearms, letting you fire off magical bolts in rapid succession, whilst spells range from powerful elemental attacks to defensive enchantments. As you can probably tell from most of the footage in the video, the fireball is incredibly overpowered. At its best, using a wand in Avowed makes you feel like a battle mage, weaving together spells and projectiles in a way that is quite stylish and satisfying. There is a real joy in setting an enemy on fire with a fireball and then finishing them off with other quick attacks. But while the wand and spell combat is fun, it does suffer from the same issue as the rest of the combat system. There's no depth. There aren't enough distinct spells that encourage different approaches to combat. Sure, you can fling fire, you can freeze enemies, or you can shock them, but most spells function as simple damage dealers rather than strategic tools. There's no complex spell interaction system, no meaningful way to combine the elements for unique effects, and no deeper mechanics like spell counters that force you to really think critically about what you're casting. A lot of the time, it's just waiting for your abilities to go off cooldown. And this becomes even more apparent as the game progresses. Early on, switching between spells and wands feels fresh because you're using new things, but after a while you realise that pretty much every fight plays out the exact same way. You fire off ranged attacks, you dodge when you need to, and you just repeat that. Since enemies don't have advanced behaviour that really make you shake up your strategy, you'll rarely have to switch up your magic beyond a preference of one element over another. And it's a shame, because Avowed has the foundation for a fantastic magic system. The visual effects are gorgeous, the spell animations feel powerful, and the dual wielding system adds flexibility, but without more depth or variety in how the magic is used, spellcasting eventually starts feeling more like a flashy version of ranged combat rather than a fully fleshed out magic system with its own layers of complexity. I will say, however, I started off the game with the intention of going for a melee build, but I absolutely hated it. I'm sure it probably gets better as you go along and unlock more skills relating to that, but I was just not digging the melee combat in this game at all. Magic combat was fun though. Another key issue is the enemy variety. While the game has a decent mix of foes, the way you fight them doesn't change too much. Most enemies just rush at you, some might use a ranged attacks, there's a couple that heal, but very few actually force you to change how you approach the fight. There aren't many enemies that make you think before engaging, which makes every single fight feel the exact same after a while. Boss fights are a real mixed bag. Some of them were quite fun, which required you to change up your strategy a little bit, but most of the time it's just the same as a normal enemy with a bigger health bar. Now don't get me wrong, combat in Avowed is still fun, it's fast paced, it's responsive, and it does have a good flow to it. The animations and visual effects make battles feel pretty damn cool, and if you're the type of player who enjoys experimenting with different builds, then you might find it a bit more enjoyable, but when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the combat doesn't have the same depth or replayability as some of the best RPGs in the genre. By the time you reach the later parts of the game, you've likely mastered your preferred style, and since the encounters don't evolve much, combat can start feeling like you're just going through the motions, which is definitely how the final stretch of the game felt for me. And that's why I think that Avowed's combat is good, but not great. It's fun, but it doesn't have the long-term depth to keep things fresh from start to finish. One of Avowed's strongest elements, though, is its visual design. The world is colourful, it's vibrant, and it's full of personality, unlike the grim, muted tones we often see in other RPGs. Avowed embraces a more stylised, almost painterly aesthetic that does help it stand out. Whether you're in the dense forests, wandering through ruins, or stepping into a lively town, the game's environments do feel inviting. However, when you look beyond the surface, Avowed's world doesn't feel as expansive or deep as it could and probably should have been. Instead of one large open world, the game is divided into 4 smaller open zones, each functioning as its own self-contained area. These regions are connected through loading screens, which is always immersion breaking, with each one featuring a central town, a handful of side quests, and 2 to 3 main missions that push the story forward. This structure is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it does allow for denser locations. Each area feels a bit more handcrafted rather than just vast open space. Since Obsidian isn't trying to make a giant open world like Skyrim or The Witcher 3, they can focus on making each location feel distinct and packed with meaningful details. It also means that the game avoids the typical open world bloat. There aren't a million map markers or tedious go here quests that artificially extend the playtime. But on the other hand, the segmented world structure does limit the sense of freedom and discovery. Unlike a true open world RPG where you travel seamlessly from one end of the map to another, Avowed makes exploration feel a lot more compartmentalised. You don't get that same feeling of setting off on an adventure, stumbling across whatever's out there. Instead, exploration is more directed. You go to a region, you do its quests, and then you move to the next one. The towns do look very cool, some of them are quite nice to stroll through, but they mainly just serve as hubs for quests and NPC interactions. They feel a lot more functional than lived in. You'll find vendors, quest givers, and the occasional bit of local flavour, but they lack the depth and immersion of towns in better RPGs. NPCs have very limited dialogue, they barely move around at all, and while the writing is generally fine, there's not much incentive to engage with any of the townsfolk outside of them giving you quests. The side quests themselves are another mixed bag. Some of them I thought were actually quite well written and added a lot to the lore of Avowed's world, while others felt very standard, go here, fight enemy, come back. There are a few standout moments where quests introduce a couple moral dilemmas or a few surprising twists, but overall, I don't think Avowed reaches the level of reactive world building that Obsidian themselves are known for. Because of this, the world feels good, but it's not truly great. It's well crafted, the art direction is fine, and there are some memorable locations, but it lacks that sense of discovery that make RPGs feel alive. The segmented structure means you're never truly lost in the world, and while exploration is enjoyable, it never feels like you're uncovering any secrets that weren't meant to be found. This is sort of a recurring motif for my thoughts with the game. I can't sit here and tell you that the world is bad, because it's not. It's just functional. It doesn't feel alive. It doesn't react. It serves to do exactly what it needs to do to work, and it does that and nothing more. That is what I mean when I relate back to the intro and I said that it's fine, but there's no soul here. Speaking of no soul, let's get into the story. At its core, Avowed's main narrative is actually really interesting. I was very engaged in the main narrative itself. You play as a godlike, a being marked by divine power, caught in a crisis that threatens the world. A plague-like corruption called the Dream Scourge is spreading, warping the land and its people, and at the heart of it all is a trapped deity, one you are destined to free. Your journey revolves around uncovering the mystery of this divine imprisonment, confronting those who stand in your way, and ultimately deciding the fate of the living lands. It's a setup that had so much potential. Themes of divinity, free will, and the consequences of unleashing a god should make for a gripping RPG experience, especially from a studio like Obsidian, who are known for their deep, morally complex storytelling. And to Avowed's credit, the main story did keep me engaged. I was interested in it. There are big revelations, there are high stakes moments, and there is a sense of urgency that keeps you wanting to push forward. But while the overarching plot is solid, the characters that populate this world, especially your companions, are shockingly forgettable. One of the hallmarks of a great RPG is its cast of characters. Think of some of your favourite RPGs of all time. Regardless of when this RPG you have in your mind released, I can guarantee you can name at least 5 characters within 10 seconds from that game. These characters weren't just party members, they were your friends. They were fully realised individuals with their own struggles, goals and compelling story arcs. I finished Avowed a few days ago and I'm struggling to remember the names of my party members. That is not good enough. Avowed doesn't have any of the things I listed previously. Your companions exist, they have their own personal quests, but none of them are very good. Their dialogue is serviceable, but lacks the emotional weight and depth that Obsidian themselves have delivered in the past. They feel like quest dispensers rather than actual people. The best way to describe your companions in Avowed is that it often just feels like they're there. They don't add much emotional weight to the journey, they're just there. And by God, the dwarf is one of the most annoying companions I've ever had in a game. I hated this dude. And it's not just the companions though, the NPCs in general don't leave much of an impression. The townsfolk, as I mentioned before, they offer quests and that's about it. You never ever meet anybody in this game and think, wow, that was an incredible character. That character does not exist. Even the antagonists feel pretty underdeveloped. While they serve their roles in the story, again, they're functional, they lack the depth or nuance that would make them truly compelling. And this is a huge missed opportunity, because the game's core themes of gods, power, corruption, are rich storytelling material. They had a really good foundation here. But by the time that the credits have rolled, you're struggling to remember any truly great interactions with a character. I genuinely don't think in a month's time I will be able to remember anybody's name from this game. And while we're on the topic of the story, I'm obviously not going to spoil anything, but I do want to point out this is one of the worst and most rushed endings to a video game, especially an RPG, that I have ever seen. The game literally just ends. I won't go beyond that, but it just ends. I was in awe that the game stopped exactly when it did. Another area though where Avowed story falters is in player choice and consequence. Now that's one that really stings. While you do make decisions throughout the game, and some of them do have impacts, none of them really have the far-reaching impact you would expect from Obsidian. Sure, you can side with different people, you can make moral choices, and you can influence specific outcomes, but a lot of it feels very surface level. There aren't any big, game-changing moments where your decisions truly reshape the world or drastically alter relationships within your companions. The main story ultimately plays out in a fairly linear way, and while there are variations in how events unfold, the overall experience remains largely the same. The main caveat to this is that in the second main world, there is a pretty big plot event that I'm not going to spoil. If you've played the game, you know exactly what I'm referring to. And this plot event is actually preventable if you do something else, but the game doesn't really indicate that to you. I was surprised when I learned afterwards that it could have played out a different way. But that's pretty much the only time something like this happens in the game. And this is another area where your companions really fall short. They don't care what you do at all. At one point I made a decision where, again, no spoilers, it led to some people dying. One of my companions had a right old go at me at camp. They were chastising me for making such an evil decision. And then the very next cutscene, he's all, let's defeat the Dream Scourge. It's immersion shattering. People may voice displeasure at you, but they don't really care. The game proceeds just as normal. Your companions will support whatever you do, even if they've told you previously that they don't support it. It is so immersion breaking, and it's incredibly disappointing that Obsidian have implemented a system like this so poorly. It's not that Avowed tells a bad story overall, it's actually a pretty engaging fantasy adventure, but without strong, memorable characters or deeply meaningful choices, it lacks the emotional weight that could make it unforgettable. By the time I finished the game, I remembered the story beats, but I didn't remember the people, and in a great RPG, it's the characters that stay with you after the credits have rolled. Now I want to quickly note on the RPG elements. For an RPG, Avowed's progression system is surprisingly underwhelming. The way you upgrade your character is pretty standard. You earn experience points from completing quests and defeating enemies, and once you level up, you gain points to invest in your abilities. The skill system itself is fine. You can upgrade different weapon types, magic, and passive abilities to tailor your playstyle. If you're focused on wands and spellcasting like I was, you can enhance your mana regeneration, your spell damage, your elemental effects. If you prefer melee, you might want to boost your attack speed, your critical hits, or defensive maneuvers. On paper, this should allow for some fun build strategy, but in practice, the system lacks a hell of a lot of depth. One of the biggest issues is how slow leveling feels relative to the game's length. Avowed is not a massive 100-hour RPG. I did most of the side content, not all, because I started to get pretty bored by the end. I finished the game in around 30 hours. I haven't actually checked. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is a more compact experience. Yet the pace of the progression feels like it was designed for a much longer game. You do not level up often enough to feel like you're constantly improving, and by the time you start unlocking the more exciting upgrades, you're nearly done. Because of this, your character's growth feels stagnant for long stretches of the game. Unlike RPGs where you're constantly refining your build and unlocking new abilities, Avowed makes you feel like you're just slightly tweaking your existing playstyle rather than meaningfully evolving it. Like, as I mentioned before, I was a spellcaster, I was using my wand, so I bought the perk that boosts your mana regeneration, but I had 150 mana regeneration items I just picked up from the ground, so that perk was actually kind of pointless. That kind of thing is very, very prevalent in this game. There's also barely any depth to loot or gear progression. You do find better weapons and armor, but it's never an exciting moment. It's just, oh, this piece of armor is red while the previous one was purple, I'll equip that one now. The gear itself doesn't have any unique traits. There are unique traits, but it's always just like a plus 10% to some stat. It's never something truly interesting, and to me, this is speculation. This progression system screams of a game that was originally supposed to be an online game, which Avowed initially was supposed to be, but they then just couldn't figure out how to retune the gear and upgrade system. All of this was clearly designed with you spending much longer playing the game in mind, but that just isn't the case here. Ultimately, while Avowed has RPG elements, they feel very surface level rather than deeply engaging. The build variety is there, I guess, but progression is too slow, and the systems don't have enough depth to make leveling and upgrading feel truly rewarding. In fact, by the end of the game, I had, I think, 4 ability points left that I just didn't use because I didn't need to. I was nearly done with the game now. What point is it going to make boosting my health regeneration or something? It makes no difference now. So, where does that leave Avowed? It's fun. The combat, while repetitive, is enjoyable. The world is beautiful, even if it's not too deep. The story is decent, but the companions are lacking. And while the RPG mechanics are there, they're too underwhelming, and the choices don't carry much weight. As you can tell, pretty much every positive point I have about the game has a drawback attached to it. But with that said, I don't regret playing Avowed. I had a good time with it, but I can't shake the feeling that it could have been so much more. I've seen a lot of people sort of say that the game feels like something you play while you wait for another game to come out, and honestly, it feels very cliche and very copycat, but I kind of agree with that feeling. This game didn't move me in any way, it didn't make me feel anything. I played it, it was cool, and then I move on to the next game. That's kind of it. Obsidian had the chance to create something truly special, but instead we got something that's just pretty good. And when you're expecting greatness, pretty good can feel like a letdown. But that's just how I feel. If you played Avowed, please let me know what you think in the comments. Did it live up to your expectations, or were you hoping for more? And if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe, as remember, we are aiming for 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year. But for now, that is all from me. Have a nice day, and goodbye.
Worse than run!